So with all the tossing and turning and all the upsets and all the implosions and collapses this weekend, college football playoff bubble looks really interesting. Right now, we need to discuss this bubble. So you got teams that I think are in. Let's just make sure we understand. Notre Dame's in. Tennessee's in. No debate. Georgia. I am a believer. Joe Tessitore was right when he said the other night, maybe 19 times on the broadcast, his prerogative, but when he said the other night, if Georgia beats Georgia Tech, they're in the playoff regardless. Whether they win or lose against Texas, they're going to be in. He's right. You may not have liked how many times he said it. He's right. I believe he's right. There is not a scenario this Saturday where Georgia loses to Texas, I don't care about how many points, and falls out of the playoff. I believe they're in regardless. Indiana, I think, is in regardless. Ohio State, yes, is in regardless. Oregon, of course, is in. Texas is in. Penn State's in. We're just trying to find out if they win the conference title or not. The Big 12 is going to have a team in here. The ACC, how many teams? The G5 will have their team in as well. So the South Carolina conundrum is upon us. South Carolina could be called the hottest team in the country. South Carolina is right there on the cusp of being in the top 12. The JP poll has been on South Carolina for a long time. And now we're looking potentially at an A-B scenario, a blind resume scenario, Bama or South Carolina. That's what it could come down to decide the final spot in the playoff. Now, there is one school of thought here, and that is, well, if it's that close, if the resumes are comparable, we're supposed to resort to head-to-head, right? And the two teams played, and Alabama won. So, boom, Bama's in, South Carolina's out. That could be the way it goes. Could be. But it wouldn't be a fun show if it was that simple. It also wouldn't be college football if it were that simple. Might I suggest there are two other built-in levers, two other hinge points, if you will, that the committee could utilize, and they're not new. They've already set the precedent two ways. Let me take you back. You remember last year, there was a team by the name of FSU. There was a player by the name of Jordan Travis, one of the best quarterbacks in the country. They're undefeated, but then he gets hurt. And the committee decides that we don't care if this team's undefeated. We don't care if they're a conference champ. We think that that quarterback was the straw that stirred the drink, and without him, we don't think they're good enough to be in the playoff. And they just took it upon themselves to leave Florida State out. In other words, they took it upon themselves to define the value of a player. And in hypothetical land, they took it upon themselves to define what that team would be with and without that quarterback. You remember the South Carolina LSU game? I do. I was there. And I remember Lenore Sellers getting knocked out of the game. And I remember them getting the screw job 9 ways from Sunday by the officiating crew. But even having said that, I remember thinking, man, if Sellers doesn't get knocked out of this game, South Carolina wins. Can the committee say that? I didn't ask you, should they? Well, forget about that. This is the College Football Playoff Committee, man. I'm asking you, could they say that? That's lever number one they could pull. Lever number two they could pull. This is how you get past the head-to-head. Do you remember last year when we were leading up to Selection Sunday and we were talking about most deserving teams? You got to put the most deserving teams in the field. And then Bill Hancock just does an interview on his own, voluntarily, and he offers up this little nugget. Quote, most deserving is not even in our lexicon. We're looking to put the best teams in. And that's how they opened the door, nonchalantly, for Alabama to go in over Florida State. They just said, because it's total BS that deserving hadn't been in their lexicon. I'd heard them say it 1,000,000 times before. All of a sudden they decided we got to build a trap door under Florida State. Let's say that we're all about the best teams, not the most deserving. Boom. They pulled the lever. Goodbye. Florida State's out. Alabama's in. They could do the exact same thing to Bama this year. I think a lot of people will look at South Carolina and think they're a better team right now than Alabama. I would. I think South Carolina is a better team than Alabama right now. But if I'm on the playoff committee and I view them as comparable, I'm supposed to look at that head-to-head result. And I'm supposed to value that head-to-head result. Because if we don't value the head-to-head, if we don't value the results on the field, especially when two teams that we're measuring against each other have played, then what are we playing the games for, right? So you can see very quickly how it looks very clear and clean-cut on the surface, but then it gets really muddy. That is why we call it the South Carolina conundrum and not merely the South Carolina situation. It is still too early to me for us to know how the committee is going to handle conference championship game losers. And it has a lot to do with whether South Carolina or Alabama or Ole Miss could even have a back door open to try and get through. The ACC, for example, SMU is playing Clemson. SMU is favored against Clemson, mind you. But SMU is playing Clemson. If Clemson wins, does SMU drop out? If SMU wins, Clemson probably drops out, and that opens up a spot. But if Clemson wins, they're in. Is SMU out? Does the committee, after having signaled that they may not punish a conference championship game loser by dropping them out of the top 12, well, SMU's in the top 12. If they lose, do they drop them out, or do we have two ACC teams in the playoff? That's something to watch. The Big Ten, Penn State. Penn State could end up the number 1 seed in this thing. So they're playing Oregon in the conference title game in Indianapolis Saturday night. Penn State, Jesse, what are they right now? They're 4th, right? We don't know what this week's rankings will be, but they were 4th last week, I think. Yeah, they were 4th. Okay, so if Penn State loses, let's say they're 3rd or 4th or whatever, if they lose to Oregon, how far do they drop? If they lose 30-13, I mean, if it's a convincing loss, how far do they drop? Because there is a big difference, friends, in being the 5 seed or maybe in the 6 seed versus being the 7 seed. You're the 7 seed, you can go play Georgia or someone like that. You're the 5 seed, you could be drawing a G5 and a Big 12 in back-to-back rounds. So I got to watch that. In the SEC, I've already told you, if Texas beats Georgia, I don't care how bad it is. I'm a believer that if you've got an SEC championship game participant in the top 12 going into conference title weekend, that team will not be punished for losing their conference title game. I do not believe that all conferences will be treated equally on that front. Whether you think that's right or wrong, I'm not here to dispute that. I'm telling you, I think they will be handled differently. The SEC will get preferential treatment. Case closed to me. I don't think there's any path. The only thing I could see is if Georgia lost and Carson Beck got hurt or something. God forbid, obviously. But if they had a major injury at quarterback and they got hurt, because then you go Jordan Travis 2.0. I also have a lot of people talking about Alabama. So I got a lot of folks who supported playoff expansion yelling, oh, you can't let Bama in the playoff with that resume. Yeah, you absolutely can let them in. Now, if the playoff looked like it should look, if the playoff looked like folks like me wanted it to look, no, Bama's nowhere near the playoff, nor should they be. That team doesn't deserve to play for a national championship in my world of college football, but we don't live in my world anymore. We live in the expanded college football playoff world. So there is absolutely a scenario or 2 or 3 where a 3-loss team, an Alabama team that lost a quarter of its games, makes the playoff and could make some noise in the playoff. I went back and forth with someone this weekend, was a big proponent of expansion, and they said, I wanted playoff expansion because we had to break up the oligarchy. We had to get all of these teams that kept on choking off the rest of the lifeblood to the sport, and they were just keeping all the riches for themselves. And, the Alabamas, the Clemsons, the Ohio States, the Georgias of the world. Hey, they fooled you. They fooled you into thinking a playoff was needed for that. An expanded playoff was needed for that. It was already coming. It was coming when Nick Saban retired, and even before Saban retired. When you got NIL in the portal, the tops of the tallest trees were already going to get shaved off. We haven't even played in one of the 12-team playoffs yet. And already look at how relatively balanced things are. Look at how few and far between the elite teams or even the elite performances are. By the way, your oligarchy there tried to serve you fair warning on this. Your expanded playoff was actually going to give them a second and third shot. Georgia's not in the playoff this year, in all likelihood, if that thing's still at 4. Bama, nowhere close. Clemson, nowhere close. Ohio State is not in that thing this year if it's 4 teams, but it's not. It's 12, and all of them have a shot now because it's 12. So I know that some of you got fooled by the people who will enrich themselves off of the expanded playoff into believing, hey, we're opening the door for Cinderella. We're adding more seats to the table. Inclusion, inclusion, inclusion. Here comes Clemson. Here comes Alabama. Here comes Georgia. And here comes Ohio State. And I got news for you. They may be flawed versions of themselves this year. The rosters are still loaded. And they may have looked all discombobulated and crooked during the season. If any one of them gets their act together when they get a 3rd chance or a 4th chance, They could make a run. 3-loss team playing for a national title. That's what the sport's all about, right?